Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving headfirst into a fascinating clash of worldviews, ancient faith meeting modern reason. We're going to break down the core arguments and counterarguments in a debate that really gets to the heart of how we understand reality itself. So, what actually happens when claims built on scripture and philosophy go up against a critique that's rooted in scientific evidence and logic? It's a real battle between two fundamentally different ways of trying to know what's true. All right, here's our roadmap for this explainer. We're going to start with the rules of the debate, then we'll jump into some core philosophical arguments, look at a direct scientific challenge, and wrap things up with the political side of it all. Okay, first things first, we have to establish the rules of engagement. You see, this isn't just about who has the right facts, it's a clash between two totally different methods for figuring out what's true in the first place. And this slide really nails the difference. On one side, you've got this top-down approach. It starts with the conclusion that God exists, and then everything else in the world is interpreted through that lens. But on the other side, it's the complete opposite. It's a bottom-up approach that starts with what we can see and measure, atoms, stars, and builds its conclusions from what can be tested. Now for the first major philosophical battleground. This is an attempt to prove God's existence using pure logic. It's famously known as the argument from contingency. So the argument unfolds in four basic steps, as you can see here. It kicks off with the idea that everything we see is contingent, which is just a fancy way of saying it depends on something else to exist. Then it says you can't have an infinite chain of things causing other things. That just doesn't work. So there must be some kind of uncaused first cause, a necessary being. And then, in the final step, they say that being is God. But this is where the counter-argument comes in, and it's a clever one. It's been called the Pink Panther objection. The critique isn't really with the logic of a first cause, nope. It's that final step, the identification. It asks, why do you get to label that cause as God? As the objection goes, you might as well say the first cause is the Pink Panther. And if we look at this table, we can really see where the argument breaks down for the critic. So in row 1, the rationalist might say, okay, I'll grant you the possibility of a first cause. But then we get to row 2, the identification, and that gets a hard rejected. Why? Because it's seen as a total leap of faith that doesn't actually follow from the logic. And maybe most importantly, as you see in row 3, there's no mechanism. How did this non-physical cause create the physical universe out of nothing? That's a huge question left unanswered. So this leads us right into the next major problem. If you can't even agree on what the first cause is, the debate naturally shifts to the nature of that cause. And this brings up a really fascinating paradox. Can a single being be both timeless and, well, emotional? According to many theologians, for God to be perfect, he has to be timeless and unchanging, completely outside of time. I mean, think about it. Being in time means you're subject to change, to cause and effect, to imperfection. This idea is called existing ex tempo. But then you open up scripture and it often describes a God who is very emotional and reactive. This timeline here shows the problem perfectly. First, someone sins. Then, God becomes angry. After that, the person repents. And finally, God becomes pleased. That's a clear sequence of events, a before and an after. It implies God is changing in response to things happening in time. And that creates a head-on collision, a direct contradiction. The abstract, philosophical God who is timeless and unchanging seems to be totally incompatible with the emotional, reactive God you read about in Scripture. You really can't have it both ways. Okay, so we've moved through philosophy. Now let's get into the hard science. This section covers what is probably the most direct confrontation in the whole debate, a very specific claim from Scripture about how the universe was created. So here's this key verse. It states that water existed before the heavens and the earth were even created. In fact, God's throne itself was on top of this primordial water. This sets up a very, very clear timeline of events. But then you look at astrophysics and it tells a completely different story. I mean, water is H2O, right? It needs oxygen. But oxygen didn't exist at the Big Bang. It was forged billions of years later inside massive stars and only got scattered through space when those stars exploded. Water is actually a pretty late-stage product of the universe. And when you put the two timelines side by side, like in this table, the contradiction is just, well, it's unavoidable. The scriptural model has water first. The scientific model shows that stars, the very factories needed to create the oxygen for water, had to come first. The rationalist critique here is simple. This is a direct scientific impossibility. So, for our final section, we're bringing this debate down from the cosmos and right back to Earth. Here, we're going to examine the ethical and political consequences that the critic argues stem from this theological framework. So the critique shifts from metaphysics to morality, and it focuses on what it describes as an ideological hypocrisy. As the slide lays out, the argument being made is that there's a perceived pattern. When a religious group is a minority, it might champion secular ideas like freedom of religion. But then, the argument goes, if that same group gains power, it sometimes rejects secularism and imposes its own divine law, taking those same rights away from others. And the critique doesn't stop there. It also argues that believing you have the one true path can lead to a kind of superiority complex that can dehumanize people who don't share your belief. And it raises another serious concern, the weaponization of the afterlife, where leaders might promise heaven to followers who become martyrs, all while they themselves stay out of harm's way. So, after going through all of this, what's the big takeaway from this clash of worldviews? At the end of the day, it really seems to boil down to a fundamental choice. Do you prefer a mechanism, or do you prefer a mystery? What all these counter-arguments try to do, cumulatively, is to systematically challenge the theological claims by demanding evidence, by pointing out logical contradictions, and by highlighting scientific impossibilities. The rationalist approach basically shifts the burden of proof. It insists that faith alone isn't enough, that claims about how reality works have to be consistent with reality itself. And that leaves us with a final, really important question. When an ancient belief collides with modern evidence, what's the result? Does it create a deeper mystery that we should just accept on faith? Or does it create a clear demand for a testable, verifiable mechanism? Your answer to that question really defines how you see the world.